You need to see these messages before we get married.
What are you talking about? This is from Regina?
She's been doing this for years.
You need to see these messages before we get married. Marcus held out his phone, his hand not quite steady, and Charlene Boone felt the floor of her own living room tilt slightly as she took it from him and began to read. 10 minutes later, she understood that nearly every relationship she'd ever lost, going back over a decade, had a single quiet thread running through all of them, and that thread had a name she never once suspected. Why did every serious relationship Charlene Boone ever built quietly fall apart within months? Always around the same point. Always for reasons that never quite made sense at the time. Who had been reaching out to the men she loved behind her back for over 10 years. And what happens when the person responsible is the one person Charlene trusted completely, the one she never thought to question? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The full picture of what Marcus showed Charlene that evening only made sense once she went back, piece by piece, through a friendship that had shaped nearly every part of her adult life. Charlene met Regina Sparks during their first week of college, two 18-year-olds thrown together by a random roommate assignment that neither of them expected to matter much beyond that first year. It mattered considerably more than either of them anticipated, the two of them becoming inseparable within a matter of weeks, the kind of friendship that absorbed holidays, celebrations, heartbreaks, and eventually careers, stretching across more than a decade without a single serious rupture that either of them could point to. Those early college years shaped a closeness that felt, to Charlene, almost like family rather than friendship, the two of them staying up until dawn some nights working through personal crises together, celebrating small victories with the kind of enthusiasm only very young friendships seemed to sustain. Charlene remembered specifically a difficult stretch during their sophomore year, a family health scare that pulled her away from campus for nearly a month, and Regina, without being asked, had kept detailed notes from every shared class and mailed them to her every single week, a gesture Charlene held onto for years as proof of exactly how deep the friendship ran. Regina was, by every outward measure, the more visibly struggling of the two throughout their 20s, cycling through jobs that never quite stuck, relationships that ended abruptly and often bitterly, a housing situation that shifted more times than Charlene could easily count. Charlene, by contrast, built a steady early career in marketing, found an apartment she genuinely loved, and dated with what looked, from the outside, like reasonable success, meeting someone new every year or two who seemed, at least initially, like a real possibility for something lasting. The pattern, once Charlene finally understood it, had repeated itself with almost mechanical precision across 4 separate relationships over the preceding 11 years. Each one started well, sometimes exceptionally well, the kind of early chemistry that made Charlene genuinely hopeful for the first time in years. And each one, without fail, began cooling noticeably around the 3 to 4 month mark, the men growing distant in ways they struggled to explain clearly, eventually ending things with vague language about not being ready, or needing space, or simply not feeling the same way anymore. The first relationship in the pattern, with a man named Terrell during her mid-20s, had felt, at the time, like the most promising thing that had ever happened to her, a whirlwind 3 months that made Charlene genuinely believe she'd found something rare. His sudden coldness afterward devastated her in a way the later breakups somehow never quite matched, perhaps because it was the first time, or perhaps because some part of her already sensed, without being able to name it, that something about the ending didn't add up. Charlene absorbed each of these endings as a personal failure for years, wondering what she consistently did wrong at exactly that stage of a relationship, seeking advice from friends, therapists, self-help books, anything that might explain a pattern that felt too consistent to be pure coincidence. Regina had been there through every single one of these breakups. The first call Charlene made each time, endlessly sympathetic, endlessly certain that the men in question simply hadn't deserved someone as wonderful as Charlene in the first place. Charlene met Marcus Odell nearly 2 years before the evening he handed her his phone. Introduced through a mutual coworker at an industry conference neither of them had particularly wanted to attend. Their relationship developed slowly and deliberately. Both of them older now, more careful, more intentional about building something durable rather than simply exciting. Marcus proposed just over a year in, and Charlene said yes without a shadow of the hesitation that had crept into her earlier relationships, certain, finally, that she'd found something the previous pattern couldn't touch. Marcus was, by nature, considerably steadier than the men Charlene had dated in her 20s, a structural engineer with a methodical, patient way of moving through both his work and his relationships that Charlene found deeply reassuring after years of chemistry that burned bright and then inexplicably fizzled. Their courtship unfolded without the intensity of her earlier relationships, something Charlene initially worried might signal a lack of passion before coming to understand it instead as the specific, durable calm of two people genuinely building towards something rather than simply enjoying an early rush neither of them fully trusted would last. The wedding planning consumed most of the months that followed, Regina fully involved as Charlene's maid of honor, helping with venue visits and dress fittings with what appeared to be genuine excitement for her closest friend's happiness. Charlene noticed nothing unusual in Regina's behavior during this stretch, no sign of the same strain that had apparently, in hindsight, quietly worked its way into every prior relationship at a similar stage. Regina, if anything, seemed more present than usual during the engagement, accompanying Charlene to nearly every appointment, offering opinions on flowers and seating charts with an enthusiasm Charlene now understands, painfully, as something closer to reconnaissance than genuine excitement. She remembers specific conversations from that period, Regina asking pointed questions about Marcus's schedule, his upcoming work trips, details that felt, at the time, like simple friendly interest in the man Charlene was about to marry. The message arrived on Marcus's phone roughly 6 weeks before the wedding, sent from an account with no identifying photo and a username that meant nothing to him at first, warning him in vague but pointed language that he should know Charlene's history before committing to marriage, referencing details about 2 of her previous relationships specific enough that Marcus initially assumed the sender had to be someone genuinely close to her. Marcus sat with the message for several days without mentioning it to Charlene, unsettled but unsure how to raise something so vague and unverified without potentially damaging the relationship over what might have been nothing more than a bitter ex trying to stir trouble. He eventually reached out quietly to a mutual friend from the industry conference where he and Charlene had first met, someone with enough tech familiarity to help him trace the account's activity patterns and the rough digital footprint left behind by whoever had created it. Those few days of silence weighed on Marcus more than he initially expected. He admitted later, caught between not wanting to alarm Charlene over something potentially baseless and a growing unease he couldn't quite shake every time he reread the message's specific details that felt too accurate to have come from a stranger with no real connection to her. He found himself watching Regina slightly differently during a dinner the 3 of them shared that same week, though he said nothing, unwilling to act on suspicion alone. The trail, once the mutual friend finished working through it, led back to a phone number that, cross-referenced against a service Charlene had once used for a group event years earlier, matched a name Marcus recognized immediately and completely: Regina Sparks. Marcus sat with that discovery alone for nearly a full day before deciding how to proceed, running through the implications of what he now knew, understanding that confirming this quietly and carefully mattered enormously given how devastating the news would eventually be for Charlene regardless of how he handled it. He decided, deliberately, that Regina deserved a chance to explain herself directly before he brought anything to Charlene, wanting to be certain of the full picture rather than accusing his fiancé's closest friend of something this serious based on a single traced phone number. Marcus confronted Regina directly before ever bringing anything to Charlene, meeting her for coffee under the pretense of discussing wedding logistics, watching her composure crack almost immediately once he mentioned the anonymous account by name. Regina didn't manage a convincing denial, her explanations growing increasingly tangled the longer Marcus pressed her, until she finally admitted, quietly and without much fight left in her, that she'd sent similar messages to nearly every serious boyfriend Charlene had dated over the past decade. She tried, in that same conversation, to frame what she'd done as protective rather than malicious, insisting she genuinely believed each of those men wasn't good enough for Charlene. Language Marcus found increasingly hollow the longer she repeated it, understanding that no genuine concern for a friend's well-being required years of anonymous, carefully targeted interference rather than a single honest conversation. Marcus left that coffee meeting shaken in a way he hadn't fully processed until he was sitting in his car afterward, understanding he now carried information capable of reshaping Charlene's entire understanding of her own romantic history. Information he couldn't responsibly sit on for even one more day regardless of how it might complicate the wedding timeline they'd both worked so hard to build toward. He brought everything to Charlene that same evening. The screenshots, the traced account, Regina's own halting admission relayed as accurately as he could manage, watching Charlene's face move through disbelief, then a kind of dawning, sickening recognition as pieces of over a decade of failed relationships rearranged themselves into a pattern she'd never once suspected. Charlene spent that first night barely sleeping, reaching out early the next morning to two former boyfriends she hadn't spoken to in years, Terrell and Dwight, relationships that had ended nearly a decade apart from each other, but that Charlene now needed to understand fully. Both men, once she explained why she was reaching out, confirmed almost immediately that they'd received similar anonymous messages during their relationships with her, messages that had planted specific, carefully worded doubts about her honesty and her past that neither of them had ever mentioned to her directly, choosing instead to simply pull away rather than raise something that felt, at the time, too strange and unverifiable to bring up. Terrell reached first, took several minutes to process what Charlene was even asking him before the memory clearly surfaced, his voice shifting audibly once he understood what she was describing. He told her he'd genuinely believed, all these years, that the message had come from someone who simply knew things about her that he didn't, someone protecting him from a version of her he'd never actually witnessed firsthand, and that he'd carried a quiet, unexplained guilt ever since for ending things so abruptly without ever telling her why. Dwight, the more forthcoming of the two, described the message he'd received nearly 7 years earlier in enough detail that Charlene recognized, with growing horror, phrasing almost identical to what Marcus had shown her, confirming this wasn't an isolated incident, but a deliberate, repeated pattern Regina had apparently refined and reused across multiple relationships over many years. He read her the message nearly word for word, having apparently kept it saved all these years for reasons he couldn't fully articulate even to himself. And Charlene sat on the other end of that call feeling something close to physical illness as she recognized entire phrases identical to the message Marcus had shown her days earlier, proof beyond any remaining doubt that this had been a calculated, repeated strategy rather than any single lapse in judgment. She spent the remainder of that day in a strange, disoriented state, moving between grief for the relationships she now understood had been sabotaged and a growing, cold anger toward the person she'd trusted most completely for over a decade. She canceled her plans for the following 2 days, unable to focus on anything beyond processing the full scope of what she'd just learned, leaning heavily on Marcus, who stayed close throughout. Understanding this required more from him than simply delivering the initial news. Charlene confronted Regina 3 days later, choosing a private setting rather than anywhere public, wanting the full truth without an audience for either of them. Regina arrived already visibly braced for the conversation, whatever composure she'd managed during the coffee meeting with Marcus long since abandoned. "How long, Regina?" Charlene asked, not bothering with any preamble. "How many of them?" Regina didn't try to minimize it the way Charlene had half expected. She admitted, in a voice that grew smaller as she spoke, that it had started with Terrell, the earliest relationship, driven by a jealousy she hadn't fully understood or admitted to herself at the time. Watching Charlene build the kind of stable, hopeful relationship Regina couldn't seem to hold on to in her own life, no matter how hard she tried. "You were happy," Regina said. "And I wasn't, and I told myself I was protecting you, that these guys weren't good enough, but that was never actually true. I just couldn't stand watching you get something I couldn't figure out how to get for myself. So you took it from me instead," Charlene said. "Every time. For 11 years, Regina. You let me think something was wrong with me." Regina didn't have an answer that made any of it smaller. She talked about years of quiet resentment she'd never processed properly, feelings she'd buried instead of naming honestly to herself or anyone else, a pattern that had calcified over time into something she almost couldn't stop herself from repeating once she'd done it the first time and gotten away with it. Charlene asked her, directly, whether she'd ever felt anything close to guilt watching Charlene grieve each of those relationships, remembering specifically the nights Regina had sat with her through tears over Terrell, over Dwight, offering comfort for wounds Regina herself had personally inflicted. Regina admitted that she had, that the guilt had been real even in the moment, but that it had never been strong enough to make her stop, each successful interference somehow making the next one easier rather than harder to justify to herself. "I need you to understand," Charlene said, "that this isn't just about Marcus. You took 11 years of my life and quietly decided which parts of it I was allowed to keep. I don't know how to be in a room with you after knowing that." Regina asked, near the end of the conversation, whether there was anything she could do to eventually earn something back, a question Charlene answered honestly rather than cruelly, telling her she genuinely didn't know, that right now she needed distance considerably more than she needed an answer to that particular question. The conversation ended without either woman raising her voice further, a strange, quiet devastation settling over the room in place of the anger that had opened it. Regina left without any final dramatic gesture, understanding, perhaps for the first time fully, the actual scope of what she'd cost her closest friend over more than a decade of careful, deliberate interference. Charlene ended the friendship completely in the weeks that followed, blocking Regina across every platform, asking mutual friends not to relay updates in either direction, understanding that whatever grief she carried over losing a decade-long friendship needed space to exist without Regina's continued presence complicating it further. She grieved the friendship genuinely, even through her anger, understanding that losing Regina meant losing a version of her own 20s she couldn't fully separate from the person who'd shared them. The grief surprised her in its intensity during those first weeks, arriving in waves that had little to do with anger and everything to do with genuine loss, small triggers catching her off guard. A song they'd once claimed as theirs playing unexpectedly in a coffee shop, a restaurant they used to frequent together that Charlene now had to consciously avoid. She found herself, more than once, reaching for her phone to share something with Regina out of pure habit before remembering, each time with a fresh small ache, that the friendship no longer existed in any form she could return to. A mutual friend reached out roughly a month after the confrontation, relaying, despite Charlene's request not to pass along updates, that Regina had started seeing a therapist, working through what the friend described only vaguely as something she needed to deal with. Charlene received the information without much visible reaction, understanding it as something she couldn't fully process yet, setting it aside without deciding what, if anything, it might eventually mean for any future contact between them. She and Marcus married as planned 2 months later, choosing not to let Regina's betrayal delay a wedding they'd both worked hard to build. Though the day carried an undercurrent Charlene couldn't fully shake, the absence of the person who would have stood beside her as maid of honor under any other version of this story. She asked her cousin to step into that role instead, a smaller adjustment than the situation deserved, but the only one available on short notice. The wedding itself unfolded warmly despite the shadow hanging over the months leading up to it, Charlene finding herself surprised by how present she managed to stay throughout the ceremony, understanding somewhere during the vows that marrying Marcus represented, in its own way, a direct answer to everything Regina had spent over a decade trying to prevent. Her cousin, stepping into the maid of honor role with only weeks to prepare, delivered a toast that acknowledged, gently and without naming specifics, the difficult year Charlene had walked through to reach this particular day. Charlene spent the months following the wedding doing something she described later as re-excavating her own 20s, revisiting old relationships with new context, understanding finally why certain conversations with Terrell and Dwight had felt so confusing and unresolved at the time, both men having pulled away based on doubts they'd never voiced clearly because the doubts themselves had never actually been theirs to begin with. She reached out to both former boyfriends again, weeks after the initial conversations that confirmed Regina's involvement, not to reopen anything romantic, but simply to offer a real explanation and, in her own way, An apology for years neither of them had understood the true reason behind. Both conversations brought a strange, quiet closure Charlene hadn't expected to need, confirming that the failures she'd carried privately for over a decade had never actually been failures of her own making. Terrell, in particular, told her during that follow-up conversation that learning the truth had changed something for him as well, allowing him to finally release a version of guilt he'd carried quietly for years. Uncertain whether he'd made the right choice walking away from someone based on information he could never fully verify. Charlene found unexpected comfort in hearing that the clarity had mattered to him too, that the damage Regina caused had rippled outward in ways that extended well beyond just her own life. Marcus remained steady throughout the entire process, never once suggesting Charlene should simply move past what had happened faster than she was ready to, understanding that the damage went considerably deeper than a single betrayal and required real time to fully process. Charlene found herself, in the months that followed, grateful in a way she hadn't expected for the specific timing of Marcus's discovery, understanding that if the pattern had continued undetected even slightly longer, it might have cost her the one relationship that had actually managed to survive Regina's interference simply by outlasting it before anyone realized what was happening. She thought often, during those months, about how close her marriage had come to becoming a fifth casualty in the same pattern, wondering whether Regina had simply been slower to act this time, more cautious given how seriously Charlene was taking the relationship, or whether some other factor had delayed the message reaching Marcus until after his trust in Charlene was already too solid to be easily shaken by an anonymous account. Charlene doesn't describe the hardest part of the entire experience as losing Regina when she talks about it now, though that loss remains real and occasionally still aches in quiet moments. She describes it instead as the strange, disorienting work of having to go back and rewrite over a decade of her own history, understanding that so much of what she believed about her own patterns, her own supposed mistakes in love, had actually belonged to someone else's quiet interference the entire time. She started, roughly a year after everything came to light, tentatively sharing pieces of her story with a small circle of close friends who hadn't known Regina personally, finding a kind of unexpected relief in having new relationships entirely untouched by the shadow of what had happened. She noticed herself trusting more easily in some ways, having finally confirmed that her earlier instincts about those failed relationships had been sound all along, and more cautiously in others, newly aware of how convincingly someone close to her had once operated without any visible sign of what she was actually doing. She built her marriage to Marcus, she says now, on considerably more solid ground than any relationship before it, not because the betrayal made her stronger exactly, but because she finally understood, fully and for the first time, that she'd never actually been the problem to begin with. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Psyche Tales TV for more stories about the quiet, invisible ways people sabotage the ones closest to them, and tell us in the comments whether you think Regina deserves any chance at forgiveness after everything she took, or whether some betrayals simply can't be walked back. Before you go, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.